we're in relationship with each other. And they would use that bread then in their own communion service. Bread must have been hard as a rock by the time they did that, but we recognize that this is important. Monasteries do the same thing. Abbots will send bread to the neighboring monasteries. The monks, if they're not going to be able to be back to the monastery in time for the daily practice of communion, will carry consecrated bread with them that they can eat at the appropriate time. So by 150, clearly this is more than a metaphor. Okay? Communion is more than a way of saying Jesus is with us in some special way. No, these elements have physically changed in ways that we can't see. This is their firm belief. By 200, we begin getting liturgies. And remember, it's in 312, okay, that Constantine fights the big battle at the bridge. Remember, we talked about that in the church history class, the Battle of the Melvian Bridge. He defeats the opposing emperor, who actually drowns. It's not like anybody actually kills him. He drowns. But Constantine cuts his head off and puts it on a plaque. That's legitimacy. That's how you say this was a free and fair takeover of the government, right? At this time, and it's the next year in 313 that we have the Edict of Milan, where Christianity is now acceptable. It is now legally sanctioned throughout the empire. By this time, this is sort of Christianity's great coming out party. By this time, the Eucharist is central to the Christian life. But they've got a number of issues they've had to work through along the way. Decorum. What is Paul writing about to them in 1 Corinthians? Some of you are getting drunk, and some of you are going hungry. How is that a potluck supper? Huh? Come on, you wouldn't do that here, right? What's our decorum? How do we behave? Remember, he's converting very much with Hellenized people. They have Greek culture behind them, okay? Where having a dinner party with your friends might mean everybody getting drunk together. So Paul's saying, no, we don't do this. Who should receive communion? Is it something we share with everybody? You know, by about 150, 200, we begin to get catechumens, what, you know, sort of our equivalent of a confirmation class. It's for new converts. It lasts 3 years, confirmands. It lasts 3 years. And every Sunday, you're expected to be in worship and you're expected to turn in a sermon outline. All right? Trust me on this. But when it came time for the Eucharist, the catechumens and their teacher would leave the service because the catechumens did not yet have sufficient understanding. Who should receive the elements? I served in a UCC church where children did not receive communion until they had been confirmed. That was just the standard practice. Took me by surprise, but that was the standard practice there. But if you're a visitor in this church, I'm not going to ask if you've been confirmed. No, sir. We are much more liberal with it. The Gnostics, we talked about them, this dichotomy between matter and spirit. It can't be good if it has matter, if it has, bread, wine, something you can touch and feel. God is entirely spirit. So the Gnostics were putting it down. And then there's this whole thing about agape meals, which seems to be what they're practicing in 1 Corinthians. But how is that different? When do we separate the agape meal out from the communion feast? Other issues that have to be worked out that we're still not really sure about. Was Jesus being literal? I mean, Jews do not drink blood. This is a shocking image. But then Jesus uses a lot of shocking images, doesn't he? Is Jesus using a handy figure of speech? Or does he mean that this blood, this wine, has been in some way changed? When Paul writes to the people in 1 Corinthians, he's writing about a weekly event. But Jesus only has the Lord's Supper once, and that's at the Passover. When did it become a weekly event rather than an annual event? What was the influence of Jewish Passover practices? What was the influence? There seems to have been some influence by the prayers that Jesus offers. They seem to be some similarities to the prayers that were used at the Passover at that time. I talked about the Greek influence at the symposiums. When you were having your time of conversation, you passed the cup around. You had a cup of wine, it would come to you, you would take a few sips, and you would get your chance to speak. You'd pass it to the next person. They'd take a few sips, it was their turn to speak, sort of like a talking stick, only it's the talking cup of wine. What do we do in communion? Lots of churches, they pass the cup, don't they? How did that happen? And then we have the influence of the mystery cults, where in the mystery cults, they are symbolically drinking the blood of their god. Probably the most famous to us is the Mithras cult, the worship of the bull, which involved the initiates being drenched in the blood of a bull. Greek culture, blood is important. So this is obviously more than just a shared meal. Shared meals were important, but this is obviously some sort of hybrid then of Hellenic culture and Judeo culture coming together. It's got different influences in different places, but as the church becomes more powerful and more centralized, then the communion liturgies become more centralized. About the year 1000 is when we get the first time the word transubstantiation shows up, but we really don't have a definition of that. It's not until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 that we get transubstantiation defined as the changing of the whole substance of the bread into the substance of the body of Christ, and of the whole substance of the wine into the substance of the blood of Christ. But still, we don't have a good understanding of how that works. It's not until later in the century that the sophists, the schoolmasters, superimpose Aristotelian metaphysics onto the practice of the Lord's Supper. I'm not going to get into that right now. If it's fascinating, I would love to talk to you about it. Transubstantiation and Aristotelian metaphysics. But understand, in the 1500s, the Reformation starts to blow up. Luther, Christ is present in the elements as fire is present in an ember, in, over, around, and above. And then it's in 1550 that transubstantiation becomes dogma. This you will believe. This leads us then into the Calvinists. And this is important, that the signifier, observing the signifier makes the signified happen. It is in the doing of it that it becomes real. This is a forerunner of what becomes known as Saussurean linguistics, named for Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist, died early 1900s. His students posthumously published his lectures taken from their notes, which has to be every teacher's worst nightmare, right? They published this course in general linguistics. It becomes extremely important in the study of semiotics and structuralism. And if you're into literary criticism, structuralism becomes the father of deconstruction, which was all the rage in the mid-1980s. When I was in school. This leads then to the westward expansion. Who is worthy to receive communion? Who can share communion? Presbyterians, for reasons of decency and order, limited to the pastor with the elders' help. The disciples of Christ, actually, who were then still part of the Presbyterians, they say, no, anybody should be able to do this. We're all blessed by God, and there aren't enough pastors to go around. This is how the disciples of Christ break off from the Presbyterians and establish their own denomination. Today, we have it defined for us in the Lord's Supper. And we have it defined for us in the Book of Order. The Book of Order is very clear. The pastor shall preside. We are making exceptions more and more as pastors become more and more scarce. But we say that service of communion shall be a regular part of the worship service. If it's not done every Sunday, that's fine, but it has to be observed at least once a month. So this paragraph I have for you lists some of the symbolism, some of the deep theology of communion. I realize I'm short of time here, but I want you to pay attention. When we gather at the Lord's Supper, this is the last paragraph that's in bold. When we gather at the Lord's Supper, the Spirit draws us into Christ's presence and unites us with the church in every time and place. It is in the doing of it that it happens. It is when we come together that we are drawn up to be with Christ. We join with all the faithful in heaven and on earth in offering thanksgiving to the triune God. This is not something that we can do ourselves. It's not something that God does alone. It is God and humanity working together, celebrating the sacrament that causes the sacrament to happen. The same way the elements are cooperation between God and humanity. We don't use apples and water, right? We use bread and wine, which is the cooperation between God and humanity to make the elements happen. Think back to what I said about the meals in Judges. It is in the act of the sacrifice that they see the divine being. Remember Emmaus, it is in the act of breaking of the bread that their eyes are open. It is in the act of coming together as God's people that by God's grace we are lifted up and we experience for a moment the divine union that is communion.